Tessa sat on a damp wooden crate in the dark, her breath forming jagged clouds in the freezing air. The wind didn't just blow, it howled through the gaps in the rotting wood, cutting right through her thin coat. 5 miles away, in a house with heated marble floors, her stepmother Eliza was sleeping soundly. Everyone in town thought Tessa had lost everything. They whispered she was the girl thrown away like garbage. But they were wrong. Because the rotting shack she was shivering in held a secret worth more than the mansion and the jewelry combined. The only question was, why did her father leave her a ruin? And what was hidden beneath the floorboards? To understand the miracle, you first have to understand the betrayal. It started 3 days earlier at the funeral. The air in the grand hallway was thick, choking on the scent of white lilies. To Tessa, they didn't smell like peace, they smelled like a cover-up. She stood in the far corner, wearing a black dress that felt too tight across her chest, watching Eliza work the room. Eliza was a master of performance. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepting condolences with a fragile, trembling grace. "He was my whole world," Eliza whispered to the mayor, her hand resting lightly on his arm to ensure he felt her trembling. "I don't know how I'll go on." Tessa wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them that Eliza had spent the last year isolating her father, intercepting his calls, and changing his doctors. But she stayed silent. She felt small, erased, like a ghost at her own father's wake. Then Eliza drifted over, a cloud of expensive, cloying perfume trailing behind her. She took Tessa's hands, her skin cool and dry, lacking any real warmth. "Oh, Tessa," she said, her voice dropping to that practiced, sympathetic register she reserved for an audience. "You look so tired, darling. Are you sure you're up for the reading later? You know how fragile you've been. Maybe you should rest." It was a subtle knife, twisted with a smile. "I'm fine, Eliza," Tessa said, pulling her hands away. "I'll be there." The reading took place in the library, a room Tessa used to love. Now it felt cold. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, sat behind the massive mahogany desk. He wouldn't meet Tessa's eyes, sweating slightly. He cleared his throat, shuffling papers that looked far too crisp. The will was short, brutally short. "To my wife, Eliza," Henderson read, his voice a flat monotone. "I leave the estate, the investments, and all personal property." He paused, finally glancing at Tessa with pity mixed with shame. "And to my daughter, Tessa, I leave the property on Old Mill Road. It was my wish that she learn the value of independence." A heavy silence filled the room. The property on Old Mill Road wasn't a house. It was a derelict shack on a plot of swampy land the town had been trying to condemn for a decade. It was an insult, a final slap in the face. Eliza let out a small, theatrical gasp. "Oh, Tessa," she said, covering her mouth to hide a smirk. "I had no idea. But, well, perhaps he was right. You've never really had to work for anything, have you? This could be good for you." Tessa felt the blood drain from her face. The betrayal wasn't just the money. It was the message. Her father, the man who had taught her to ride a bike, had apparently decided she was worthless. He had left her with nothing but a pile of rotting wood. She stood up, legs shaking. She didn't look at the lawyer. She didn't look at Eliza, whose eyes were gleaming with triumph. Tessa walked out of the library, out of the mansion, and into the cold afternoon. She thought she was walking away from her life. She thought her father had abandoned her to the wolves. She accepted the cruelty, believing she was unloved. But she was wrong. She didn't know that the trash she had been given was actually a fortress. Tessa shoved the last cardboard box into the trunk of her rusted sedan. It contained her entire life now. 3 sweaters, a pair of worn boots, and the silver locket her mother had given her before she passed. She slammed the trunk shut, the metallic echo sounding like a gunshot ringing out in the quiet driveway. She looked up at the mansion one last time. The limestone facade glowed warmly in the afternoon sun, a fortress of comfort she was no longer allowed to enter. In the second-story window, the velvet curtains twitched. Eliza was there. She wasn't waving. She wasn't crying. She was watching with the cold, predatory stillness of a reptile waiting for its prey to finally stop twitching. For a split second, the mask of the grieving widow slipped completely, revealing a smile so sharp it could cut glass. Eliza had won. She had the house, the money, and the legacy. Tessa shivered, not from the cold, but from the malice radiating from that window. She got in the car, turned the key, and didn't look back. The drive to Old Mill Road took 40 minutes, leading her away from the paved, manicured streets of the estate district and deep into the overgrown belly of the county. The pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to mud. When the property came into view, Tessa gasped. House was a generous word. It was a rotting carcass. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, covered in moss that looked like a spreading infection. The siding, once white, was now the color of a bruise, gray and streaked with rot. Weeds choked the front porch, climbing the pillars like green chains, trying to pull the structure back into the earth. It looked angry. It looked like it wanted to hurt anyone who dared to step inside. Tessa stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. The front door was swollen shut from years of rain and neglect. She had to throw her shoulder against it 3 times before it gave way with a screech of rusted hinges that sounded like a scream. The smell hit her instantly. It was a thick, wet wall of mold, decaying wood, and animal droppings. She covered her nose with her sleeve, her eyes watering. The thin light from the open door cut a sharp path through the gloom, illuminating piles of garbage. Fast food wrappers from a decade ago, broken beer bottles, a mattress that had been shredded by rats. This wasn't just neglect, it was desecration. Her father had left her a landfill. The sun began to dip below the tree line, and the temperature inside the house plummeted. There was no electricity. She flipped the switch by the door out of habit, and the darkness just laughed at her. There was no heat. The fireplace was choked with debris and bird nests. As night fell, the house came alive. The biting wind didn't just blow around the house, it blew through it, whistling through cracks in the walls. The walls groaned. Something skittered across the floorboards in the corner, tiny, sharp claws on wood. Mice. Or rats. Tessa huddled in the center of the living room, the only spot that looked relatively structurally sound. She had no bed. She had no chair. She laid her coat down on the least filthy patch of floor she could find. The wood was hard and freezing against her hip. She curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to preserve whatever body heat she had left. This was her inheritance. This was her life now. She felt a tear slide down her nose and drip onto the floorboards. She had never known what true, biting cold felt like until this specific moment. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the absolute isolation. She was a mile from the nearest neighbor, 10 miles from a town that didn't care, and the universe away from the father who was supposed to protect her. She closed her eyes, praying for sleep to take her away from this nightmare. She thought she was lying in a tomb, a place where things went to die. She thought this was the end of her story, but she was wrong. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't sleeping on a rotting floor. She was actually sleeping right on top of a vault. Morning broke grey and unforgiving through the boarded windows. Tessa woke up stiff, her breath still visible in the stale air. She looked around at the mountain of filth, the sodden magazines, the rusted cans, the debris of strangers who had treated her inheritance like a dumpster. It was overwhelming. It was disgusting. She could leave. She could drive away, admit defeat, and let Eliza win. She could prove everyone right about the fragile girl who needed a marble mansion to survive. Tessa stood up, her joints popping in the cold, and grabbed a heavy black trash bag from her trunk. She wasn't going to leave. She was going to dig. The work was brutal. For 3 days, she became a machine of removal. She hauled bag after bag out to the overgrown yard, her muscles burning with a fire she hadn't felt in years. She scrubbed walls until her knuckles bled, the water in her bucket turning black instantly. The smell of bleach battled the smell of rot, stinging her eyes and burning her throat. She scraped layers of grime off the windows, letting the first real light filter into the gloom. But as she peeled away the layers of neglect, something strange happened. Beneath the grime, the house began to speak. She scraped a thick layer of mud off the floorboards in the hallway and found not rot, but solid, honey-colored oak. It wasn't cheap pine. It was expensive, old-growth timber, the kind you didn't find in modern houses. The staircase banister, once she stripped the peeling grey paint, was hand-carved mahogany smooth as glass. Then the sky turned a bruised purple and the rain came. It wasn't a gentle shower, it was a deluge that hammered the roof like gravel. Water started dripping in the kitchen, then the hallway. A steady plink, plink, plink that threatened to undo everything she had fought for. Tessa didn't panic. She grabbed a blue tarp she found in the shed and a ladder that looked like it might snap under a cat's weight. She climbed onto the slick, mossy roof in the driving rain, the wind whipping her hair across her face, blinding her. The shingles were slick with algae. She slipped once, her boots sliding on the wet moss, her heart hammering against her ribs as she caught herself on the chimney. She wasn't just fixing a leak, she was defending her territory. She nailed the tarp down, screaming into the wind, refusing to let the elements take this from her too. When she climbed back inside, soaked and shivering, the house was dry. She had won. The storm passed, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Tessa went back to the living room to finish the baseboards near the massive stone fireplace. She was measuring the wall for a patch of drywall when she stopped. She looked at the tape measure, then at the wall, then at the window. It didn't make sense. She went outside, pacing the length of the exterior wall, counting her steps carefully. 20 feet. She went back inside and measured the interior wall again. 15 feet. She stared at the fireplace. 5 feet were missing. It wasn't a closet. It wasn't a utility chase. It was dead space, a void where a room should be. She pressed her ear against the plaster. Silence, but it felt heavy, dense. The air in this corner of the room didn't circulate. It was stagnant, holding its breath. She felt a prickle on the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched by the house itself. It wasn't a haunting, it was a puzzle. Her father hadn't just left her a fixer-upper, he had left her a riddle wrapped in wood and stone. The house wasn't just hiding space, it was hiding a specific purpose. Tessa didn't wait to second-guess herself. She drove her rattling sedan to the only hardware store in the county, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. She didn't have money for contractors or structural engineers. She had $40, a credit card that was nearly maxed out, and a gut feeling that was screaming at her to break something. She bought a 3-pound sledgehammer, a pry bar, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The old man at the counter looked at her, a girl in a designer coat covered in 3 days of grime, and didn't ask a single question. He just rang her up. Back at the house, the silence was heavy. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Tessa stood before the fireplace, the wall looming over her like a judgment. She took the handle of the hammer in both hands. She tapped the wall to the left of the hearth. Thud. Solid wood. She moved a foot to the right. Thud. Still solid. She moved another foot, right into the center of the dead space she had measured. She swung the hammer lightly. Tock. The sound was different. It wasn't the dull, flat absorption of wood against a stud. It was hollow. It echoed, bouncing back at her with a higher pitch. There was air behind this wall. A lot of it. Tessa took a breath, stepped back, and swung the hammer for real. The impact jarred her shoulders, sending a shockwave up her arms. The plaster cracked in a spiderweb pattern, dust puffing out like smoke. She swung again. And again. The anger she had been holding back, the anger at Eliza, at the lawyer, at her father for leaving her here, poured out of her with every strike. Chunks of drywall rained down, covering her boots in white powder. She hooked the pry bar into the hole she had made and pulled with everything she had. A large sheet of rotting drywall tore away with a screech of nails, crashing to the floor. The dust cloud was thick, tasting of chalk and old paper. Tessa waved her hand in front of her face, coughing, and shined the flashlight into the darkness she had exposed. She expected to see insulation, maybe rats, maybe just empty darkness. She didn't expect to see her own reflection. Behind the rotting wood and the water-stained plaster, there was a wall of solid steel. It was cool to the touch, industrial and seamless. In the center of the metal panel was a heavy, reinforced door, the kind you would see in a bank vault or a panic room. It was incongruous, impossible. A fortress gate hidden inside a shack. Tessa ran her fingers over the cold metal. To the right of the door frame, mounted flush with the steel, was a digital keypad. The screen was dark. She pressed a button. Nothing. No beep, no light. The house had no electricity, and whatever internal battery this system had was long dead. She was staring at a miracle she couldn't open. She slumped against the wall, the adrenaline crashing. She had found the secret, but she was still locked out. Then her eyes landed on the car keys in her pocket. She didn't think, she just moved. She ran out to the driveway, popped the hood of her sedan, and unbolted the car battery. It was heavy, a dead weight in her arms as she hauled it across the overgrown yard and up the porch steps. Her arms shook, her muscles screaming, but she dragged it into the living room. She found a spool of copper wire in the shed and stripped the ends with a kitchen knife. It was crude, it was dangerous, but she was past caring about safety. She touched the wires to the battery terminals, then jammed the other ends into the exposed leads of the keypad. A spark hissed, blue and angry. Then, a miracle. The keypad chirped. The small LCD screen glowed a bright artificial green in the dusty room. Now she just needed the code. Tessa stared at the blinking cursor. 6 digits. It could be a million combinations. She closed her eyes, trying to think like him. Not the distant, sick man he had become in the last year, but the father he was before. She remembered the Sunday mornings in his study. He would sit her on his knee and make her recite numbers. He called it the game. He would say, "Tessa, people can take your things. They can take your house. But they can't take what's in your head. Remember the sequence." She had hated it. She wanted to play with dolls, and he was making her memorize random strings of math. She thought he was just being strict. She didn't know he was giving her a key. 8, she whispered, the memory surfacing from the deep. 4, 2, 1. She hesitated. There were 2 more. 9, 0. Her trembling finger hovered over the keypad. 8, 4, 2, 1, 9, 0. She pressed the buttons. Each beep sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. She hit the pound key. For a second, nothing happened. The green light just blinked. Tessa held her breath, terrified she was wrong, terrified the memory was just a ghost. Then came a sound louder than the wind outside. Clack, thunk. Heavy mechanical latches retracted inside the steel door. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized air. The door groaned, swinging inward on perfectly oiled hinges. Darkness spilled out, but it wasn't the smell of rot or mold. It was the smell of old paper, leather, and conditioned air. Tessa grabbed her flashlight and stepped over the threshold. She wasn't walking into a room. She was walking into the answer to every question she had ever asked. The beam of her flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a space that simply shouldn't exist. It was a library, a bunker, and a bank vault, all in one. The air was crisp, filtered, and smelled of cedar and old leather. A sharp, shocking contrast to the moldering decay just a few feet away. There were no rats here. There was no rot. There was only order. Along the left wall, floor-to-ceiling metal shelves groaned under the weight of what they held. Tessa stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just supplies, it was a fortune. Rows of gold bars sat stacked like bricks, their dull yellow sheen capturing the flashlight's beam. Beside them were vacuum-sealed bricks of cash, $100 bills bundled tight, enough to buy the mansion she had been kicked out of 3 times over. There were velvet pouches that spilled diamonds and emeralds onto the steel shelving. This was the trash Eliza had laughed at. This was the inheritance of a girl who was supposed to be destitute. But Tessa didn't stop at the gold. Her eyes were drawn to the center of the room, where a heavy mahogany desk sat, pristine and dust-free. On top of it, illuminated by the single beam of light, was a thick leather binder. It looked important. It looked final. Her hands trembling, she opened it. The first page was a document titled Last Will and Testament. But it wasn't the one Mr. Henderson had read in the library. This one was dated 3 days before her father died. It was notarized, signed, and stamped with a seal she didn't recognize. I, Robert Blackwood, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all former wills. She scanned down the page, her heart hammering against her ribs. I leave my entire estate, including all liquid assets, properties, and holdings, to my daughter, Tessa Blackwood. To my wife, Eliza, I leave nothing. As per the prenuptial agreement she violated upon her infidelity and theft. Tessa gasped, the truth crashing over her. Under the will was a handwritten letter. The ink was blue, the handwriting shaky but determined. It was his voice, speaking from the grave. My dearest Tessa, it began. If you were reading this, then you were brave enough to look beneath the surface. I am so sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was alive. Eliza was poisoning me. I found the traces in my tea weeks ago, but by then, I was too weak to fight her publicly. She has the doctors, the lawyers, and the town in her pocket. If I had tried to change the will openly, she would have had me declared incompetent, or worse. I had to play her game. I had to make her believe I was discarding you to save you. Tessa read on, tears blurring her vision. I knew she would never step foot in this house. Her vanity is her weakness. She sees a ruin. I see a fortress. She sees trash. I see a vault. I moved everything, the gold, the bonds, the real deed, here, bit by bit, before I got too sick. I let her think she won, so that you could survive long enough to find the truth. You are not weak, Tessa. You are the daughter of a man who built an empire from dirt. Now, build yours. Tessa dropped the letter. She fell to her knees on the cold floor, a sob ripping through her chest. It wasn't a cry of grief anymore. It was a release of every ounce of shame she had carried since the funeral. He had turned her exile into an escape plan. She wasn't the girl in the trash house anymore. She was the owner of a fortress. But as she wiped her eyes, a sound cut through the silence of the woods outside. Heavy tires crunching on gravel, a car door slamming. The silence of the deep forest was broken. Eliza wasn't done yet. Eliza didn't knock. The front door, which Tessa had struggled to open just days ago, swung wide as her stepmother stepped into the gloom. She looked absurd standing there, a pristine figure in a cashmere coat and Italian leather heels, surrounded by the rotting carcass of the house. She held a perfumed handkerchief to her nose, her eyes scanning the room with undisguised disgust until they landed on Tessa. Tessa stood in the shadows near the fireplace, her body blocking the view of the open steel door. My God, Eliza said, her voice echoing off the bare walls. It smells worse than a grave in here. I told you, Tessa, I told you this place was a hazard. She stepped gingerly over a pile of debris Tessa hadn't cleared yet, careful not to let the grime touch her shoes. But I'm not a monster. I can't let my late husband's daughter live in squalor. I've spoken to the city council. They're going to condemn this shack tomorrow. Bulldoze it. Tessa didn't move. She felt the heavy, cold weight of the leather binder in her hands behind her back. Is that so? She asked, her voice steady. Eliza sighed. a dramatic exhale of long-suffering patience. Yes, but I have a solution. A developer friend of mine is willing to take the land off your hands. He's offering $5,000. It's charity, really, considering the cleanup costs. Sign the deed over to me, take the money, and go find a nice apartment in the city. Leave this trash behind. The mask was gone. There was no grief in Eliza's eyes, only the sharp, calculating glint of a vulture spotting a dying animal. She didn't want the house. She wanted to erase Tessa completely. She wanted the final victory of buying Tessa's inheritance for pennies. "You really think I'm that stupid?" Tessa said softly. "You think I'm just the fragile little girl you painted me as?" Eliza laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, honey, you are. Your father knew it. That's why he left you here. He knew you'd fail. He knew you'd come crawling back to me for scraps. He didn't trust you, Tessa. He pitied you." Tessa smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that stopped Eliza mid-sentence. "He didn't pity me, Eliza. He prepared me." Tessa stepped aside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dust, hitting the open vault door. The light reflected off the stacks of gold bars, casting a warm, impossible glow across the rotting floorboards. It illuminated the rows of cash, the jewels, and the pristine order of the hidden room. Eliza froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at the gold, then at the cash, her brain failing to comprehend the image. The trash, she had mocked, was a treasury. The ruin was a bank. Her eyes bulged, shifting from arrogance to a primal, terrifying greed. She took a stumbling step forward, her hand reaching out involuntarily. That's his money," she stammered, her voice trembling. "That belongs to the estate. That belongs to me." "Not anymore," Tessa said, holding up the leather binder. "He knew about the poison, Eliza. He documented everything. The theft, the lies, the arsenic. It's all here. And this," she tapped the notarized document, "is the only will that matters." Eliza's face drained of color. The horror wasn't just about losing the money, it was the realization that the husband she thought she had fooled had been playing her the entire time. She wasn't the predator, she was the prey. "Give that to me," Eliza hissed, lunging forward, her fingernails hooked like talons. She didn't care about the pretense anymore. She was desperate. But she never reached Tessa. Blue and red lights flashed through the boarded-up windows, painting the room in a strobe of chaotic color. A siren wail cut through the silence of the woods. Tessa didn't flinch. "I sent the photos to Mr. Henderson and the district attorney 10 minutes ago," she said, her voice calm over the rising noise of slamming car doors outside. "They were very interested in the toxicology reports Dad hid in the safe." The front door burst open. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, their hands on their belts. Eliza spun around, looking for an exit, but the room was a trap. There was nowhere to run. The fragile girl had outmaneuvered her. As the officers read Eliza her rights, listing fraud and attempted murder, the stepmother didn't scream. She just stared at Tessa with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Tessa watched them lead her away, Eliza's expensive heels dragging through the mud she had tried so hard to avoid. When the police cars finally drove away, taking the noise and the malice with them, the silence returned to Old Mill Road. But it wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. Tessa stood on the porch, breathing in the cold air. It tasted clean. Over the next year, the rot disappeared. Tessa used a fraction of the gold to hire the best contractors in the state. They replaced the roof, restored the siding to a brilliant white, and cleared the overgrown yard. She planted lilies in the garden, reclaiming the flower Eliza had tainted, turning it into a symbol of her own victory. The house wasn't torn down. It was reborn. The trash house became the jewel of the county, a stunning estate that hid its steel heart behind warm oak and stone. It stood as a monument to a father's love and a daughter's resilience. Tessa sits by the roaring fire in her restored living room, the deed resting safely in her lap. The storm outside can howl all it wants. She is warm, safe, and finally home. If you believe that truth always finds a way to the surface, subscribe to see the next secret revealed. The story isn't over for the vultures, but for Tessa, the war is won.